From the war in Ukraine to the horrific terror attack on October 7 and the subsequent conflict in the Middle East to the roiling waters of the South China Sea, the world today is in crisis. The causes are not in Moscow or Tehran alone, but primarily in Washington and Beijing. They are the consequence of two fundamental and interrelated grand strategic mistakes made by the United States. First, there was an allure to understand the threat from the People's Republic of China. Second, the failure to balance against it. As a result, the U.S. is at risk of losing its dominant position to an emboldened PRC working in cooperation with Vladimir Putin's Russia and the mullahs in Iran. When surveying the global unrest, Americans must comprehend three reasons they face this dire strategic landscape. First, U.S. elites did not perceive the threat due to the triumphalism of the end of history, the false assertion that modernizing nations like China were on the path to democratization and free market economics. Great power conflict was seen as an artifact of the past. This hubris contributed to what we term threat deflation, where U.S. decision-makers consistently dismissed or underestimated the threat from the PRC year after year. Second, U.S. business interests and financiers indefatigably sought economic gain from cooperation with Beijing. This facilitated China's rise as it entered the West's financial ecosystem, as did its admission to the World Trade Organization. Their influence on the major U.S. political parties and at the highest levels of U.S. politics hindered the U.S. response and promoted the conceit of globalization. Thus emerged an engagement school, which asserted that by engaging the PRC, it would become wealthy, a responsible stakeholder in the international order, and even democratic. The United States willingly and enthusiastically taught, trained, and even equipped its mortal enemy. Business interests and financiers funded our national security think tanks, which contributed to a bias towards the engagement school and thus, the threat deflation of the PRC. Third, Deng Xiaoping, arguably one of the greatest strategists of the 20th century, advanced a brilliant political warfare strategy to promote threat deflation. Deng's approach focused on the U.S. and other Western elites, enriching them and shaping their perception of the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party while using the enticement of a growing market to influence their behavior. For a generation, Chinese leaders masked their intentions and framed their expansion as economic, for the good of all, rather than strategic and for the benefit of the CCP. Consequently, the PRC has risen and now employs its power to the detriment of U.S. national security through its worldwide actions, especially in the East and South China Seas and Taiwan, as well as through its proxies in Iran and Russia. To meet this threat, Washington first needs to see Communist China for what it is, an aggressive great power that seeks the overthrow of the United States. Second, the United States must support the education of strategists so younger generations may understand how to defeat the PRC. Education in the principles of power politics and the CCP's ideology is essential to victory. Third, there must be sustained presidential leadership to define the enemy, educate the American people, and generate the necessary whole-of-government response. Fourth, the failure of the intelligence community to identify China as an existential threat significantly weakened the ability of U.S. national security decision-makers to identify and act against the threat. The engagement school of thought informed the fundamental assumptions regarding China's behavior. Ultimately, and perversely, the intelligence community was aiding threat deflation for a generation. This must be reversed. Fifth, U.S. military leadership did not recognize and prepare for China's emergence as a formidable military power. It must also be held accountable for the current state of unpreparedness. Specifically, the failure of the U.S. Navy's leadership to recognize the centrality of the maritime domain to the PRC's grand strategy and its naval modernization efforts stands in stark contrast to the proactive performance of prior generations of admirals from World War II through the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Leadership needs to prioritize rebuilding the U.S. Navy to meet the PRC threat. China understands the weaknesses of the United States. As Sun Tzu's Art of War states, "Know the enemy and know yourself, and you will never be defeated in 100 battles." If China intends to overthrow the United States, its leaders must deeply understand their opponent's weaknesses. Jin Xianying, director of the China Foreign Strategy Research Center at Renmin University, often referred to as the national strategist of President Xi Jinping, delivered a lengthy speech in July 2016 in which he said, "The United States has a problem, which is that it is truly too diverse. Among Western countries, it has the highest level of democracy." Of course, diversity has its advantages. The people have freedom and the right to speak. However, it also has its drawbacks. It is tough to achieve internal consensus. For the United States, the best scenario is to have a clear external enemy, which allows them to reach political consensus more easily. However, the United States will become confused if there are two adversaries, as before World War II. At that time, the U.S. had two enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Internal conflicts arose in the U.S., and as a result, before they could fight their enemies, they began fighting among themselves. But if the U.S. faces three adversaries, they will start to get dizzy. If there are four adversaries, they will be lost entirely. China's strategic mission is to ensure that the U.S. always has four enemies, and one of them must be terrorism. Russia may seem like an enemy, but that alone is not enough. According to this Chinese expert, the more enemies the U.S. has, the less attention they can pay to China. And if terrorist groups are the enemies of the U.S., then of course Beijing has every reason to nurture them. On July 8, 2021, Biden officially announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan after 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars spent there. What many don't know is that the Taliban was not truly alone. While the U.S. supported the Afghan democratic government, the Taliban had the backing of China. On July 28, 2021, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in an even more significant meeting with the U.S., met with the Taliban's top leader, Mullah Baradar. The meeting signaled the growing relationship between the two countries. Starting the following month, articles justifying the Taliban began flooding the front pages of Chinese media. By September 2nd, a month after that meeting, the Taliban spokesman stated that China was their most important partner. The Chinese Communist Party has established a training camp in western China to train guerrilla terrorists from Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries. Interestingly, Beijing has appointed anti-terrorism officials from the Ministry of Public Security to train these forces. Among them is the former police chief, Meng Hongwei. According to insiders in the Chinese government, Meng once said that they only needed to spend $10,000 to train a guerrilla terrorist like those from the Middle East or Iraq. But when these fighters return to the Middle East, they will cause massive military and economic damage and drain the United States' national power. In addition to strengthening terrorist organizations, China also seeks to maintain conflicts across various regions of the world with the primary goal of keeping the U.S. preoccupied. In Northeast Asia, it's North Korea. In Eastern Europe, it's the Ukraine war. And in the Middle East, it's Iran. There was only one time they failed in their strategy, under Trump. This president sidelined all other adversaries, ended the wars, and made America realize who the real threat to them was.